Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Literary Translation Centre. My name is Daniel Hahn. I'm not going to be on this panel. I'm just going to briefly introduce it. This, as you will have gathered from the programme, is a session on getting started in literary translation. We have, to my immediate right, Roland Glasser, who's a translator, Antonio Lloyd-Jones, a translator, and Jill Schoolman, a publisher, and they're going to be answering your questions on this subject. This is not going to be a kind of proper chaired discussion. It's going to be the same format as yesterday's if you were here. Each of them will just talk very briefly, just a couple of minutes, sort of introducing themselves and the subject. But the idea is the session is going to be led by what do you want to talk about. So they're going to just take your questions for about half an hour on anything in the general area of getting started in translation. So do think about what you want to talk about, and they will be led by you. So I'm going to leave them, and maybe I'll ask Roland to start with an introduction, and then ask them some questions. You have half an hour.
Right, so I'm Roland Glasser. How did I get into translation? Well, very quickly, I studied French and theatre studies, then went off immediately after I graduated to live in Paris, to live an exciting artistic life, or so I hoped, and did various odd jobs for a couple of years, did some work in theatre, lighting design, production, bits and bobs. Then I thought I would like some kind of freelance job that didn't involve going to the office, and I thought, well, I'm bilingual and I quite like writing in English, so I can be a translator because, it's just putting words from one language into another, right? And after a number of years, and including several embarrassing translation misdemeanors, I eventually became a not too bad translator. And more years went by, and I thought I would direct myself towards literary translation. I would try and do that. And I was already a member of the Translators Association. And it was about the time the Emerging Translators Network was being set up a couple of years ago. And I did lots of networking and helped run reading groups for And Other Stories. And I'm just completing my first novel for And Other Stories in a co-translation with Louise Rogers-Lallery. So that's me.
Do we each introduce ourselves? Yeah. Okay. Do I have to press anything? No. Does that work? Yes. I translate Polish literature. I started by a series of accidents. I had no idea I was going to be a literary translator at all. But I had studied Russian, met somebody who was a very well-established translator of Russian, who said, how about you helping me with some stories that I have to translate? So I did, and he, in a way, just mentored me unofficially. And then I started learning Polish, and again by accident, met a Polish writer who had a fantastic new book out. And the established translator showed me how to prepare information for publishers, gave me some publishers' names. And so I pitched this book to these publishers with an extract that I'd translated. And at that time, I had no idea that I would translate the whole of this book. That wasn't the thought I had in mind, in fact. And they came back saying, we want this book, and will you please translate it? So I said to everyone around me, my friends, I said, I don't know Polish, how on earth can I do this? They said, oh, go on, give it a try. And rather tentatively, and in fact, with the help of people who knew what they were doing, who could just go through work with me, I ended up translating this book, which was a success. However, I didn't work as a full-time literary translator for another 15 years. In the meantime, I had a sensible job and earned a large amount and bought myself a flat, and only became a full-time translator once I had a little bit of support behind me. Although I always did some translation on the side, but I didn't think of it as a way to earn a living. Now I do actually make my living out of it, which is hard work, but so in a way I'm out through the classic route of having a mentor. But nowadays we have official mentorships, which are run by the British Centre for Literary Translation, which I could highly recommend. I myself am a mentor for Polish translators who are starting out, and that's an absolutely wonderful resource. And in fact, I have been sometimes finding my mentees through the summer school, which this year will be run by the City University, which is another resource which I would recommend checking out, where there are groups of starting translators being led through workshops run by experienced translators.
Hello, I'm Jill Schoolman, the founder and publisher of Archipelago Books. We are devoted to international literature exclusively, both classic and contemporary, and based in New York, and I feel lucky to be here. And rather than tell you about Archipelago too much, I might just tell you about sort of how we find translators and how we connect to translators. I mean, the answer is a long story, and it's different for every book. But we're very open to hearing from translators about projects, and especially if they would make sense for our list. We have sort of there's certain kinds of books. If you see our catalog, which I ran out of, we have a website, archipelagobooks.org. It's definitely important to get a sense of what we do before writing to us, but we're open to ideas, and I really would love to see excerpts rather than just the initial idea. I know that some publishers would rather have a synopsis or hear more about your work first, but I can go ahead and send a bit of a book that you're excited about. A sample would be fantastic. And we really rarely are able to pay for samples, so that's where we are now. I hope at some point we'll be able to have a situation where we can pay the translators for the samples. But sometimes we do. But if we can get support from an agency or government to do that. Anyway, perhaps that's enough for an introduction.
So over to you with questions.
Is there a microphone?
Yes.
Great. Questions? Hands up if you want to ask a question. No questions. That's great.
That's it, we're done.
That's
Over
a question.
Hi. I often hear that to translate to English, you actually have to be English. I'm Dutch. I studied here at a UK university, and I'd actually be interested in translating from Dutch to English. Would that be possible for me to do?
You can say what you think, then I'll say. Okay.
There is often a lot of confusion about this, which is why, I mean, it's true that generally one would translate into one's strongest language, which is usually one's native language. But there are people who have, through the vicissitudes of their upbringing or their life or whatever, have ended up in a situation where they may have 2 or even 3 languages, which they speak extremely well. Sometimes even their strongest language ends up being the language that not their native language. So yes, it is possible. Yeah.
I would add something on that. I get a lot of people coming to me with this question because I translate Polish, and there's a lot of Polish people here now who have been living here for some years and are quite interested in translating to English. And I used to say firmly, this is absolutely impossible, go and translate into Polish. However, I'm open to suggestion. And from my experience, I found that you can get very proficient in a foreign language. I mean, essentially, when you're a translator, you're a writer, so you've got to be able to write in that language. And that's the challenge, and that's where sometimes if you haven't grown up in the country of the target language, there will be things that you might not know. However, a fantastic route is co-translation. And I've seen some very good results with people working together. Somebody who was born with the original language but knows English very well, and someone who is a native speaker of English who knows the foreign language. And I would highly recommend doing that and working with somebody else. It's often also a good way to get started. And collaboration is a wonderful thing, and you can get some very wonderful results. I've also found in my summer school classes, it's actually, at first when I was teaching the summer schools, the rule there was no one except native speakers of English, and there simply aren't that many people who know Polish well enough. So I opened it up to Poles who were studying at universities in Britain and who were using English at a very high level. And I found it's fantastic having at least one Polish person in the class, because that person will have a sensitivity to some words and some of the nuances of words, which I can't have because I didn't grow up in Poland. So I would say look at the idea of co-translation, and another route is to do creative writing courses in English. I think is another way. If you've got your English up to a very high level, but you might feel a bit antsy about being able to write into it in a literary way, creative writing courses might be more useful than translation courses. Gentleman here.
Hello. In terms of translation, when we go through history, David Dages says that when the Bible was translated from King James Commission scholars, it is mentioned that the Bible was translated sometimes words by words and sometimes sense by sense. As an emerging translator, what should we concentrate upon? Should we go near the literal translation, or should we try to convey the sense of the piece of work from one language to other? Because at the end of the day, language is nothing but a tool to convey ideas between minds. So should we go near, should we try to translate a piece of work in, word by word, and try to go near literal translation, or try to convey sense?
I would say that sense always trumps literal translation. Translation is not replacing some words by others in the other language. Oftentimes it may well be that half or most of what you do is depending on the language, can be very similar to what is in the original. The mistake I made when I first started out as a translator was that all the words were exactly right. They were very well translated and all the meaning was there, but I wasn't aware, bizarrely, of enough of the differences in syntax between French and English, between the differences in sentence structure. And that's where I came a cropper with quite a few things. Yeah.
We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Where's the mic gone? Where's the mic? Is there a microphone? I'm sorry.
It's okay. I can't hear him at all.
Because language is actually from a certain area. Talk about some languages, Asian languages. The proverb of sunny days is considered as difficult days. In this area, the sunny days are considered pleasant days.
Mm-hmm.
So if you translate sunny days into sunny days, it will become, the sense will be totally opposite.
Yeah.
It might depend on what you were translating. If you're translating poetry, you might be being more creative to try to convey the style and the way that poet writes. But then, of course, I think as a translator, you have to think not just about your writer. You have to be true to your writer, but you must also be true to your reader. So there are cases where you might change that particular example, but it's a kind of case-by-case situation.
And cultural context is obviously very important. A translator has to not just know the language, but has to know the culture as well. So.
Gentleman there at the back.
Yeah.
Could I just ask, obviously some people, you got into translation by sort of happenstance, but if you are actually trying to pitch an idea, what is it that a publisher or the person you're pitching it to would most be looking at? What would be the thing to focus on there to get people to be interested in what you're interested in?
Yeah. Well, I think really the most important thing is to reach out to people that are doing the sort of books that you're passionate about or interested in. Really do your homework there before even the first email or the first letter. And once you do find maybe a few presses, I think it's okay. Other publishers might disagree, but I think it's okay to send out to a handful of your favorite presses or the presses that you think would make sense for what you're doing for the book. And then maybe really look at their website and see how each publisher likes to be approached, because I could tell you something and then a big house could tell you the exact opposite. So I prefer an email that shows that you know who we are, and it shows that it's sort of with a short explanation of why you think the book would make sense on our list, and a bit about the author, a bit about you, and an excerpt. As long as an excerpt is possible. The longer the excerpt, the better. But I understand that it's time and you should be paid. But
yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I don't know, it's difficult to sort of suggest what would be the standard thing. I suppose that I would say a synopsis that's quite concise, and I guess maybe 2 chapters. Often it's good to have the beginning of the book, because that's what often, if people are browsing in the bookstore, that's the first thing they'll read. I've heard, one publisher say that, if the first sentence doesn't grab him, he doesn't even consider it. And then maybe an excerpt or 2 from somewhere else in the book, particularly if the book has different parts, as it were, or different things going on.
I would just add that if you want to try and approach publishers with a book that you're very passionate about and you want to try and infect them with your belief in this book, as Jill said, it's a good idea to do your research on your publishers and make sure you're pitching to the right people, otherwise it's a complete waste of time. But also, the first thing to do before you do anything is check the copyright situation with the work in question. Make sure that the copyright is free and that no one else is already working on it. Otherwise you might be very disappointed. And then some people think it's just never going to work trying with different publishers, but you sometimes have to be quite persistent, and you sometimes end up with the man who turned down the Beatles situation. I've just been in this happy state recently where a book that no one was interested in suddenly is having a fight among publishers over it. So persist.
I would also add that what's also useful when contacting a publisher is to include any information you can find on how well the book sold in the original country, any prizes it either won or was nominated for, and also to think of reasons, why that book would work in Britain or in the US or whatever.
Think from the publisher's point of view. They've got to sell the book, and you can use review quotes from the original.
And one more thing. I was thinking that, one little happy story. We just took on a new translator who's never translated a full book. And what she did, she was very, very, this is a very smart way to go about it too. She got in touch with Gallimard and said, I love this author, I love this book. If you sell the rights to this book, please let them know that I'd like to be the first person that they consider to translate it. And then we asked her to do an excerpt, and it was very good, and we went with her. So that's a possibility too. Yeah.
Gentleman at the back.
Question to Antonia. You mentioned a mentoring program. I'm an experienced German translator. Can you tell me a bit more about the program?
Okay, the program has been running now for nearly 4 years. The first year there was a kind of pilot program with just 2 pairs of translators, some of whom are in this room. And then the first full year, I think there were about 10 or so, and then it went up to about 15. I think it's about 12 now. So it varies from year to year. And the way it works is that the umbrella organisation for the mentorships is the British Centre for Literary Translation, and then the mentorship languages, each pairing is funded perhaps by a cultural institute. In my case, it's the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not culture, via the Polish Cultural Institute. And the idea is that an experienced translator is given the task of mentoring a younger one for 6 months, and each year it's from January to the end of June. And within that time, essentially, you work out between you as a mentor and what we've come to call a mentee, for lack of any better word. You work out what you're going to do together. And then there are certain things that the mentee will produce. A translated text which will appear in a publication called First Lines. And then they will all read out some of their work at an event where they all come together in July after the mentorship program is over. And people can apply to be mentees. There's a process. It's all on the British Centre for Literary Translation website, and people can apply for to be mentees, and then the mentors select from among the candidates.
I should contact the British Centre for Literary Translation in the first instance.
Look at their website, yes.
Excellent, thank you.
And down the front here, please.
I have a question specifically for Jill Schoolman, right?
Yeah.
Okay, at Archipelago. I'm going to be quite honest. I've targeted Archipelago a couple of years ago, and I'm going to send you a pitch. But what I would like to ask you specifically is, if someone's going to pitch a collection of short stories, what do you want to see with that? Because I think it's a little bit different in terms of excerpts. Are you happy to have a sample story?
Yeah,
to look at?
absolutely. That would be fantastic.
Okay, that's
yeah,
great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask you for your card before I leave.
You can have it.
Okay.
Or next to you, even.
Hi, the question for Antonia, actually. I was just interested to hear that you said that you described yourself as a Polish to English translator, and then started by saying you'd started out with Russian. Do you not work from Russian at all? Did you make that as a conscious choice? Because I've got 3 languages, and I don't quite know whether to market myself with all 3 languages, or whether I should focus on one.
Well, it's really entirely up to you. I didn't, it's a long story, but I studied in the Soviet Union, and I studied Russian from the age of 12 right through university, and only went to Poland just after I'd graduated, and it was dismal. It was martial law, but I felt, hooray, this is what I was looking for. I'm at home. And something clicked. And then after that, I started learning Polish properly and switched completely. And I have used my Russian professionally, but I haven't ever focused on it as a translator because there were already quite a lot of people doing it. And at the time, I just didn't want to compete. And I went to see somebody to try and get advice. It was a woman who was an established translator of Russian, who was kind of quite, run along kiddie kind of thing. So I focused on the Polish. However, if you've got several languages, I know there are translators here. The person to talk to is Sean Whiteside, partly, who translates from a tremendous number of about 6 or 7 different languages. So it is perfectly feasible and rather wonderful. And I sometimes think, oh dear, I ought to brush up my Hungarian, which is in a parlous state. And I would say it's probably rather wonderful to translate from several.
The only thing I would add to that is that there are some languages, such as French or Spanish, where there are already a lot of people. So if you have several languages and one of those is maybe less popular, there are less people working in that, that could be a way to find more of a niche.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between the translator and the original author. For example, I have a book that I'd love to pitch to somebody. I don't know the author, I just happen to have read the book. It seems a little kind of quite rude to write to a publisher and say, I'd like to translate this book without contacting the author. What's the protocol?
Well, I think the protocol would really be to contact the original publisher of the book and, say that you're interested and are the foreign rights available in English. It's not, you don't have to contact the original author. It's not rude. It's quite normal to go that route.
Once you're working on the book, you might well have contact with with the writer, and it can be a very wonderful thing. It can also be rather a terrible thing. Sometimes it's an advantage if the author's dead, but sometimes it's very frustrating.
Any other questions? Over here at the side.
Hello, this is a question for Antonia. I'm bilingual with Polish, and I've studied various forms of writing. Would you say that's enough, or is there a course that I need to do?
Well, I would recommend if you come along on our summer course at City University, which is a course which was at Birkbeck until this year, and has been run for, I think this is the 4th year now, and the Polish is in its 3rd year, and that'll give you a good idea of where you are and what you can do, because it's hard to say. I mean, I really, frankly, deep down believe that translators are born like writers rather than made, and there's an awful lot you can gain from studying and sharing ideas and so on. However, just having something in your system and then working and working and working away at it is really the best way to develop. So maybe you know that you've got that, that you're a writer of that kind, but if you want to find out more about your capacities, I would recommend that you sign up for our summer school.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I would also mention that BCLT also runs a summer school. They won't be running it this summer, but they've been running them for about 10, 15 years. There's usually several languages each year, and you work with an experienced translator and a writer on their text in small groups over about a week. And that's another great way of exploring if that's something for you and developing your skills.
Hi, I've got a question about actually sort of language combinations. I actually have a slightly strange situation in that I speak both French and Welsh. And so I just wondered if you'd ever heard of anyone translating from Breton. And I don't, if anyone's ever done that, sort of gone from a main language, say Italian, and learnt Sicilian or Sardinian and sort of started translating that way as well.
I don't know. I don't see why not. I mean, if there are books being published in the language from which you wish to translate, and there's one that's good, it's, there's
no reason not
there's
to.
No reason not to at all.
Trick is to find the publisher that's excited about it. Yeah.
Anyone else?
There's one there.
She mentioned the prize. She mentioned the translator's prize.
Hello. I was wondering, with regards to translation of poetry, if you have an idea for poetry and you want to pitch it to someone, what's the publisher basically looking for? Thank you.
Poetry.
I do have some experience with this. Shall I say something?
Yeah, translation.
I translate one Polish poet non-stop. And one's enough for me. I mean, I've never thought of myself as a poetry translator particularly. And this chap came to me. I had translated a few of his poems for someone else for a promotional reason. And he wanted me to translate his poetry. And I said to him, I can't do poetry. And he said, go on, I like what you've done. Please, would you do these? So I said, all right, but I'm not selling them for you. There's nothing I can do with this. So I translated the poems, and I met with him, and we discussed them and tweaked them and so on. So there were some translations ready. And then he started sending them around poetry journals. And this is the way to do it. Research all the poetry journals and send a few things. Look at their sites. They usually tell you about submissions. They have submission periods, some of them. So send send submissions into them. I suddenly started getting checks in the post. I had no idea that all this stuff of mine was appearing in these journals. And then after a while, we had quite a lot of them out there floating about. And so he said to me, I'd quite like to do a book. So I consulted friends who are translators of poetry who recommended particular publishers to pitch a book to. And I was able to go to those publishers and say, we've had this number of poems published here, there, here and there. And we did a book. And since then, we've done some festivals. We've just had a poem in my translation published in the New Yorker, which is kind of rather wonderful. And we're doing a second book. So journals is the route.
Thank you.
Yeah, just say about that.
So a couple of things to mention. One is the Harvel Secker Young Translators Prize, which happens every year with a different language. And you have to be under 35, I believe. It doesn't say that here. This year the language is German, and the website is youngtranslatorsprize.com, And the judges are A.S. Byatt, Sean Whiteside, who's a translator, Sally Ann Spencer, who's a translator, and Eddie Steele, who's an editor. They'll be considering translations of Der Hausfreund, a short story by Julia Frank. And the winning translator gets £1,000 and a mentorship with Sean Whiteside, supported by BCLT and the Goethe Institute. So that's one thing to mention. And the other thing is the Emerging Translators Network, which functions mainly as a Google group and is a great resource if you're wanting to get into literary translation or just starting at the beginning of your career for sharing information. We have a website which is, if you Google the Emerging Translators Network, you'll find it. It's it's emergingtranslatorsnetwork.wordpress.com, something like that. And actually on 21st July, we're running a full-day conference at Free Word where there will be experienced translators speaking, top publishers and various people. And it's called The Business of Literary Translation, and it's all about how to get into translation, how to approach publishers, everything you need to know. I did put some flyers around. I've got a couple of flyers here. So, yeah. And just to say that if anyone wants to ask anything else about the Emerging Translators Network or getting into translation or anything like that, I'll be at the Translators Association table on the other side from 3 to 5. So do drop by.
There's also a Stephen Spender Prize for Poetry Translation. So if you look at the Stephen Spender website. I think we're out of time now, aren't we? So thank you very much for coming.
Thanks very much.